Even the Dark Ages were not uniformly dark. There were attempts to restore productivity and order. There was the brilliant success of a Frankish king crowned in Rome as Emperor of the West. But what looks exciting to us today must have been hell to live through. The age of Charlemagne, this time on the Western tradition.
And now UCLA professor Eugene Weber's continuing journey through the history of Western civilization.
Last time, we ended on a rather bleak note. We were in the Dark Ages, that dismal period between the 6th and the 9th centuries when violence and corruption, both physical and spiritual, were endemic in Europe. But of course, history is never as neat, let alone as linear as we like to think. At the grassroots level, great things were also happening in the Dark Ages. Historians disagree about the exact date, but sometime between the 6th century and the 10th century, a new heavy plough with wheels began to replace the old light plough that had been used for thousands of years. The new plough dug deep and turned over furrows instead of just scratching the topsoil the way Mediterranean ploughs did and often still do. About the same time, a new method of planting came in, more complex rotation systems like the triennial system that left one field fallow once every 3 years to recuperate its powers. That way sheep and cattle could feed in the fallow fields and then on the stubble left in the planted fields after they had been harvested. And the manure the animals dropped could improve the crop yield further. Productive power was increasing in other ways too. This is a medieval flour mill which was made possible by the appearance of the crank sometime during the Dark Ages. The crank, which is the most important motion transmitting device after the wheel, now turned grindstones and hand mills and pulleys. This was also when water power was harnessed by water-driven mills to grind grain or cut logs, and when the use of animal power was immensely improved. The ancients had been terribly inefficient in their care and use of farm animals. They had no nailed shoes, which meant a lot of broken hooves and a lot of beasts limping around. And they had only a yoke harness, which was all right for oxen, but not very good for horses. They also didn't know how to harness one animal in front of another, only abreast, which meant that great weights had to be drawn by gangs of slaves. By the 9th century, however, the development of nailed shoes, the tandem harness, horse collars, meant that one team could pull 3 or 4 times the weight that a Roman team could manage. It created a new supply of non-human power at no extra cost, doing for the 10th century what the steam engine was going to do for the 19th century. With this increase of productivity among North European peasants, the economic center of the continent shifted from the shores of the Mediterranean, where it had been for many centuries, to the great plains between the Baltic and the North Sea and the English Channel. Amid disorder and violence, despite disorder and violence, there was more food, there were more people, there was more activity. North Europeans were also going to surpass the people to the south in power. The extra wheat and meat the northerners produced made them bigger and stronger. The extra oats they grew permitted them to breed and feed larger horses and to build up a heavy cavalry that could use another new invention, the stirrup, which let you sit firmly in the saddle and allowed you to charge with a lance without falling over. From the 8th century on, these new heavy-armed, heavy-armored horsemen were going to be the tanks of the medieval battlefield, stopping the Arabs at Poitiers in France in 733. This increase in power was especially important because history is really about power, who gets it, who keeps it, who uses it, who loses it. You cannot have society without power, or culture, or art. And power is about numbers of people, but also about productivity and metals and money. After all, there are more goods available if you have cheaper and more efficient ways of producing them. More goods make it easier to fight wars and to win them. And so you see, the military-industrial complex is nothing new. The traditional metal of war is iron. Since the time of the Assyrians, the army with the most iron tends to win the war. The early Middle Ages were going to see a serious increase in the production of iron and the number of foundries. Iron continued to be pretty expensive, but there was more of it in Northern Europe than around the Mediterranean. And then in the 9th century, iron became available for uses other than weapons. Spade tips, plow parts, ordinary tools, when new iron mines were opened that made the metal cheaper. The brilliant success of one tribe, the Franks, was based on this new advantage in productivity. For them, as for most German tribes, war was a national institution, almost their main trade. The most important Frankish king was named Charles. History knows him as Charles the Great, Charlemagne, Charlemagne. And he was simply the most successful representative of this warlike enterprise. He inherited the Frankish kingdom from his father, Pepin the Short, and proceeded to enlarge it. From the 770s to his death in 814, Charlemagne campaigned ceaselessly and successfully from Spain and Italy and Dalmatia to Germany and Bohemia. Charlemagne was also an able statesman who provided his dominions with fairly effective administration, based on literate clerks and on tough, illiterate royal officials, military commanders with territorial responsibilities, called by titles that still survive today. Dukes, from the Latin dux, meaning leader or commander, counts, from the Latin comes, a trusted companion of the king, and margrave or marquis, who was the person in charge of border provinces, the marches, the march. Charles was operating in a society that produced relatively little surplus. His administrative reforms aimed at getting the land, and especially the imperial estates, to provide more of a surplus, or at least setting up a structure that would permit him to cream off more of a surplus. The surplus would go towards supporting the armies which he led, and which could be very large indeed, as much as 20,000 horsemen and 3 times as many footmen. Now, if you think just how many oats you need to feed that many horses, how many wagons you need to carry the grains and other supplies, how many supplies you need just to prepare the army for moving out, you can see the logistics of military campaigns could be pretty impressive. But so was the ultimate purpose of all this effort.
Politically, Charlemagne's aim was to revive the Roman Empire with its stability and greatness. And indeed, on Christmas Day in the year 800, he was, as you know, crowned in Rome as Emperor of the West. He saw himself as charged by God to restore and maintain the social order and the values this order represented, and he believed that this could best be done by reference to ancient Rome. Since architecture is often an expression of politics, you can see in the palaces and abbeys Charlemagne put up the expression of this attempt to return to Roman sources, to revive the empire by imitating its forms, and also to spread the civilizing Christian message associated with Rome. The most effective means of instruction and edification was mural painting, which offered a kind of holy comic strip of biblical images for a largely illiterate public.
Now remember that the 8th and 9th centuries were also the time of the iconoclastic struggle, of the tension between Rome and Constantinople about whether religious images, icons, were good or bad. So you can see why the Pope, Leo III, thought images were essential to carry the Christian message, and why he appealed to Charlemagne to help. And how also he wound up crowning Charlemagne the Emperor of the West for this and other favors. Images were also good for publicity and prestige. They could present a legendary historical background for a family or a people, as was done in one of Charlemagne's palaces at Ingolsheim, where the great hall was surrounded by paintings of the history of the Franks, as the Franks would have their history looking.
At a more sophisticated level, Charlemagne patronized the production of illustrated manuscripts and books like this Bible, and he provided rich endowments to the clerks, scribes, and illuminators who produced them, and to the monasteries where these men were sheltered. Charlemagne hoped that the monasteries would also generate administrators and educators. Scores of new monasteries went up, and hundreds of churches were built or restored, richly decorated. Towers and bell towers especially grew taller, nesting places for angels and archangels who were expressly invited to alight and perch there to protect humans against lightning and sin. Taller also because they were impressive and visible from afar, and practical as watchtowers. Watchtowers were going to be needed soon because a lot of the new buildings were going to fall within a generation or two. Most of the great monastic foundations disappeared in the time of troubles that followed the death of Charlemagne. One of these, the Abbey of Saint-Riquier, was built in the 790s near Amiens in northwest France. It held 300 monks, a school with 100 students, 110 knights with their own chapel, and a great host of servants to serve all these people. Charlemagne's special sympathy for scholars and clerks meant that he was always a favorite with them, and that was reflected in the documents of the time. But Charlemagne's reign was not based on intellectual pursuits or scholarship. It was based on war, on violence successfully exercised, as was the entire Carolingian dynasty of Frankish kings, which ruled for 2.5 centuries from the time of Charlemagne's father to the year 987. But when Carolingian civilization could no longer meet violence with superior violence, it foundered. Charlemagne wanted to be a Roman emperor in fact as well as name, but he died in 814 like a Frankish chief, dividing his lands among several legitimate sons. It could have been worse since he had hundreds of bastards. Charlemagne's successors were incompetent and divided. After 820 or so, Norsemen, Hungarians, and Saracens brought even worse horrors to Europe than had been suffered in the centuries before Charlemagne. Saracen is simply the Byzantine word for a Muslim Arab. Westerners borrowed it to describe the Muslim enemy that kept pushing north across the Adriatic, the Mediterranean, and the Pyrenees. The Saracens raided into the Alps and into central France. They even sacked Rome in 845, but that was becoming a tradition. Everyone who was anyone had to sack Rome. Although the Hungarians never managed to get that far, they did spread terror throughout the rest of Europe. Hungarians were a Turkic people from the Eurasian steppes, and they displaced the Huns from what is now Hungary. They ravaged to the walls of Constantinople all over Germany and France, as far as Burgundy and the Rhone Valley, and well down into Italy. They were the scourge of Europe until defeated and converted in the second half of the 10th century. As a matter of fact, our word for the gigantic, hungry ogre whom a lot of fairy story heroes meet and defeat derives from the word for Hungarian, Hungar or Hongre. But the main threat to Western Christendom came from Scandinavian pirates and invaders, the Northmen, also known as Norsemen or Normans. They were also called Vikings, perhaps after the narrow channel between Sweden and Denmark, the Vik. The Viking danger was not new. It had been staved off since 800 or so by Carolingian diplomacy, busy missionary activity, and, of course, arms. When the successors of Charlemagne started to fight each other, Viking attacks on their kingdoms became more serious. In 845, a Danish king destroyed Hamburg, which was at the time the northernmost outpost of Christian civilization. In the same year, Paris was sacked, and the King of France, Charles the Bald, paid a heavy ransom to the Danes to get them out again until next time. But these disasters were only the prelude to the main Viking attack on the west, which began around 850 and continued without a stop for the next 50 years. During these years, it wasn't any longer a question of isolated pirate raids, but of skillfully planned invasion by highly organized professional armies that didn't just want plunder, but sought conquest and settlement. Year after year, Norwegian and Danish Vikings launched campaigns against Germany, the Netherlands, England, France. They defeated what armies the kings could gather. They could take and sack almost any town or abbey in their way, and few places were safe from their swift, shallow draft ships and their heavy swords. Swedish Vikings also penetrated the lands east of the Baltic, along the Dnieper and the Volga rivers, in the 800s. The name of the land we call Russia comes from the Finnish name for these Vikings, Ruotsi, or rowers. They were going to melt into the Slav population. But their expeditions provided an essential link between the West and the Eastern Roman Empire, between the Baltic and the Black Sea and the Caucasus. In the West, however, Viking colonies were set up during the 900s throughout the Atlantic islands, in England, Ireland, Iceland, Greenland, with some landfalls on the North American continent. Most important, though, was the settlement in the lower valley of the Seine that would become a buffer state between French territories and other raiders. This became the Duchy of Normandy, and in due course, its rulers managed something the other Vikings never had, the conquest of England in 1066.
Still, for 300 years, until Christian kingdoms were established in Scandinavia in the 11th century, Viking destruction continued because this is what the Northmen did best: sail, fight, and rob. But the robbery was often part of a larger enterprise, trading. Like Phoenicians or Greeks, the Vikings were merchants as well as pirates. Like the Assyrians, their pillaging raids and wars also redistributed wealth. Indeed, it's quite likely that their major role was to release wealth stored in Western treasuries and put it back into circulation. They stole from the monasteries, and they used the silver to buy land to settle on or to equip ships to trade with. And so the Vikings probably did a lot to reopen internal commerce in Europe and contributed to the beginning of economic revival from the doldrums that they themselves had helped create.
In the meantime, however, they destroyed a great deal and killed for the fun of killing. It's of these years that a chronicler of 884 wrote, "The Northmen cease not to slay and carry into captivity the Christian people, to destroy the churches and to burn the towns. Everywhere there is nothing but dead bodies. Clergy and laymen, nobles and common people, women and children. There is no road, there is no place where the ground is not covered with corpses. We live in distress and anguish before this spectacle of the destruction of the Christian people."
These terrible years also witnessed the final collapse of the Carolingian Empire. The failure of the last attempt of Charlemagne's successors to rally the united forces of the West around the surviving representatives of the House of Charles, this failure was followed by a new alignment of power. The new successful leaders were not the weak kings. They were local leaders who maintained a bit of order and who organized resistance against outside attacks. Eudes, the Count of Paris, or Rollo and his descendants in Normandy, or Henry, the Duke of Saxony, and his son Otto, who finally beat the Hungarians to a pulp. These new princes derived their authority from their military leadership and from their power to protect their country. And indeed, a series of victories by the mid-900s would mark the turn of the tide. Much suffering was still in store for the West, but the worst of the horrors had passed, and the survival of Christendom was secured, as we shall see next time.